When historians rank the worst monarchs in Spanish history, one name sits at the absolute top of that list. Every single scholar who studied his reign comes to the same conclusion. There has never been a more depraved, more cruel, more sexually deviant king to sit on the Spanish throne. But you don't know the real story, because what you've been told about royal marriages, about noble bloodlines, about the dignity of European monarchy, it's all a carefully constructed myth designed to hide the grotesque reality. Ferdinand VII didn't just rule Spain, he turned the royal palace into a den of sexual horror that would make even the most hardened brothel madam blush. Before he became known as El Rey Felon, the Felon King, he was a prince so physically deformed, so sexually incompetent, that his own mother-in-law wrote letters describing him as not even a man. This is one of the only documented cases in European history where we have multiple eyewitness accounts, from royal physicians, from foreign diplomats, from the victims themselves, all describing the same horrifying anatomical reality that shaped a nation's destiny. What you're about to discover will completely shatter your understanding of royal power. It's simultaneously the most pathetic and the most terrifying story of sexual dysfunction ever recorded in the annals of monarchy. So let me take you back to a wedding night in 1819 that became so infamous, even the Pope had to intervene. October 1819, the Royal Palace of Madrid. A 16-year-old princess sits trembling in her wedding chamber. Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, raised in a convent, innocent to the point of believing babies came from storks, waits for her new husband to arrive. She's been told nothing about what happens on a wedding night. Her German attendants, too embarrassed to explain, simply dressed her in white and left her alone with a rosary clutched in her hands. Then the door opens. What enters isn't the charming prince from fairy tales. It's a 35-year-old man, overweight, gouty, with thick, protruding lips and the eyes of a predator. But that's not what makes the young queen's blood run cold. You see, Ferdinand VII suffered from a condition so extreme, so grotesque, that modern medical science still struggles to explain it. Macrogenitosomia, in plain English, his genitals were monstrously oversized. But not in the way you might think. French writer Prosper Mérimée, who interviewed courtiers present that night, described it in horrifying detail. Thin as a sealing wax taper at the base, and as thick as a fist at the end, as long as a billiard cue. Imagine being a sheltered 16-year-old girl raised by nuns suddenly confronted with that. The young queen took one look and bolted from the bed, screaming in pure terror. But here's where it gets worse. Ferdinand, drunk on wine and lust, gave chase. Picture this. A morbidly obese 35-year-old king stumbling around the bedroom trying to catch his teenage bride who's literally running for her life. The girl was fast, the king was not. Enraged by this insult, Ferdinand did what any reasonable monarch would do. He burst out of the bedroom completely naked, his deformity on full display, and began screaming at the queen's attendants. He called them whores and brutes, demanding they prepare the queen for him within 15 minutes. These poor ladies, including the queen's own sister-in-law, had to somehow explain to a terrified child what was about to happen to her. Whatever they said made things infinitely worse. When Ferdinand returned, ready to claim his rights as a husband, he was met with a smell that no amount of royal perfume could mask. The young queen, in her absolute terror, had lost complete control of her bowels. The King of Spain, in all his grotesque glory, found his wedding bed soiled with human waste. He recoiled in disgust, declaring that queens do not possess the fragrance of civet, and stormed out, refusing to touch his bride for over a week. But this was just the beginning of Maria Josefa's nightmare. To understand how a wedding night could go so catastrophically wrong, we need to talk about what Ferdinand VII was hiding under those royal robes. And I warn you, this gets medically graphic. Multiple physicians who examined the king left detailed records. Dr. José María de la Fuente wrote, "His Majesty possesses a member of such extraordinary dimensions that normal conjugal relations are rendered impossible without causing severe injury to his partner." But it wasn't just the size, the shape itself was an aberration of nature. Remember Mérimées' description, thin at the base, massive at the end, like some kind of medieval torture device. This wasn't a blessing. This was a curse that had haunted Ferdinand since his first marriage at age 17. You want to know how bad it was? Let me tell you about that first wedding night. In 1702, young Prince Ferdinand married his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples. On their wedding night, the prince, and I'm quoting directly from Maria Antonia's letters here, merely gawked at his bride and awkwardly fondled her, repeatedly groping her bosom, unsure how to proceed. He literally didn't know how sex worked. For 11 months, this marriage went unconsummated. The prince would become aroused, attempt to mount his wife, then nothing. He physically couldn't figure out how to make it work. His anatomy was so abnormal that basic human reproduction became an impossible puzzle. Maria Antonia's mother, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, wrote increasingly frantic letters. "My daughter weeps nightly. The prince feels nothing. Attempts to induce him are useless. There is no pleasure or effect. This situation is extraordinary and unfortunate for whoever is at his side." Eventually, the royal confessor had to intervene. A Catholic priest had to sit down with the future King of Spain and explain, in explicit detail, how to have sex with his wife. The humiliation spread through every European court. The Spanish heir was a sexual incompetent, a physical freak who couldn't perform the most basic marital duty. When he finally managed it, after nearly a year of failures, the damage was catastrophic. Maria Antonia suffered 2 miscarriages, likely from internal injuries, and died at just 21, her body broken by her husband's deformity. But here's the sick part. Once Ferdinand finally figured out sex, he became obsessed with it. The death of his first wife in 1806 freed Ferdinand from the marriage bed, but it also unleashed something monstrous. The prince who couldn't perform became a king who couldn't stop. When Ferdinand returned to power in 1814 after Napoleon's defeat, he was 30 years old, sexually frustrated, and drunk on absolute power. What followed was a decade of debauchery that would make Caligula blush. Every night the king would slip out of the palace wearing a dark cloak, his destination, the seediest brothels in Madrid. His favourite was run by a madam nicknamed Pepa la Malagueña, an establishment so notorious that decent people crossed the street to avoid walking past it. But Ferdinand didn't go alone. He assembled a crew of young aristocrats, men as morally bankrupt as himself, and together they turned Madrid's red light district into their personal playground. Here's where it gets truly perverted. Ferdinand was so proud of his deformity, the very thing that had humiliated him in youth, that he turned it into a party trick. Multiple witnesses report the same stomach-turning scene. The King of Spain, drunk on cheap wine, would challenge his companions to measurement contests. Each man would expose himself and they'd literally compare sizes. Ferdinand always won. His friends even gave him a nickname, El Bien Dotado, the well-endowed one. The king would strut around these brothels, his monstrous anatomy on full display, bragging about his conquests. But the bragging was the least disturbing part. Ferdinand had developed a particular fetish, one that reveals the true depths of his depravity. In his own words, recorded by Count José María de Villalobos, the king boasted, "They leave my bed certain that no other man can give them the pleasure I gave them. And do you know what I enjoy most after possessing them? Collecting the rags stained with the proof of their maidenhood." Let that sink in. The King of Spain collected bloodied sheets from the virgins he deflowered. He kept them as trophies. This wasn't some medieval tradition. This was a personal fetish, a grotesque hobby that he pursued with the same enthusiasm other kings collected art. While the Prado Museum was being built, ironically by his neglected second wife, Ferdinand was building a collection of blood-stained evidence of his conquests. The prostitutes at Pepa la Malagueña's weren't his only victims. As he travelled around Spain, Ferdinand left a trail of ruined women, a widow in Aranjuez, a peasant girl in Sacedon, servants in the palace who couldn't refuse their king. Each encounter added to his collection, each bloody rag another trophy in his chamber of horrors. Meanwhile, Spain was falling apart. While Ferdinand spent his nights measuring genitals and collecting virgin blood, his country lost its entire American empire. Liberal reformers were executed by the thousands. The economy collapsed, but the king didn't care. He had brothels to visit, women to ruin, trophies to collect. This was the man who would take 3 more wives. 3 more women who would discover that marrying the King of Spain meant entering a nightmare beyond imagination. In 1816, Ferdinand needed an heir. His solution? Marry his own niece. Maria Isabel of Braganza was 19, plain-looking, and Portuguese, 3 strikes against her in the Spanish court. Madrid's gossips greeted her with a cruel rhyme. Fea, pobre portuguesa, chupate esa. Ugly, poor, and Portuguese. Suck on that. But Maria Isabel had something her husband lacked: dignity. While Ferdinand continued his nightly brothel raids, she quietly founded the Prado Museum and opened the Royal Academy to women artists. She tried to bring culture to a court drowning in depravity. Ferdinand barely noticed. To him, she was just a womb, a vessel for the heir he desperately needed. And in 1818, she finally became pregnant. This is where Ferdinand's story transforms from grotesque comedy to pure horror. When Maria Isabel went into labour, complications arose immediately. The baby was breech, the queen was fading. The royal physicians faced a choice: save the mother or save the child. Ferdinand made the decision without hesitation. Save the child, he commanded. Cut her if you must. What happened next was witnessed by 12 people, all of whom left matching accounts. The surgeons began performing an emergency caesarean. Remember, this is 1818. No anaesthesia beyond alcohol and opium. They sliced open the queen's abdomen, believing her unconscious. She wasn't. Midway through the procedure, Maria Isabel's eyes shot open and she let out a scream that echoed through the palace. She was awake, fully conscious, as they cut through her womb. The surgeons, panicking, continued their butchery as the queen writhed in agony. The baby was already dead, had been for hours. Maria Isabel bled out on the operating table, her final moments spent in unimaginable pain, sacrificed for a child that was never going to live. She was 21 years old. The queen's sister publicly blamed Ferdinand for her death. Palace whispers suggested that his deformed anatomy had caused complications during conception. Others pointed to his syphilis, a gift from all those brothel visits, as the cause of the stillbirth. But Ferdinand felt no guilt. Within a year, he was shopping for wife number 3. After all, he still needed that heir. If Maria Isabel's death was a tragedy, what happened to Ferdinand's third wife was a farce so obscene that even the Pope couldn't ignore it. Remember Maria Josefa, the 16-year-old who soiled herself on her wedding night? Well, that was just the opening act of her marital horror show. After the wedding night disaster, Ferdinand refused to touch his teenage bride for a week. When he finally returned to her bed, she fought him off with surprising strength. This girl, raised by nuns to be meek and obedient, turned into a wildcat when faced with her husband's advances. She bit, she scratched, she kicked him in his monstrous genitals hard enough to send the king howling from the room. But the resistance couldn't last forever. Ferdinand was the king, Maria Josefa was his property. So he tried a different approach: patience. Every night he would enter her chamber. Every night she would pray the rosary while he attempted to seduce her. The queen had a powerful weapon in her arsenal: ignorance. She genuinely believed babies came from storks. When Ferdinand tried to explain the facts of life, she accused him of lying, of trying to trick her into committing a mortal sin. God would not create such a vile method of creating life, she declared. You are testing my virtue with these lies. Weeks passed. Months. Ferdinand, the man who bragged about his sexual conquests, couldn't bed his own wife. The court was whispering. Foreign ambassadors were reporting back to their governments. The King of Spain was being sexually rejected by a teenager. Finally, Ferdinand played his trump card. He wrote to the Pope. Pope Pius VII, an elderly Italian who had survived Napoleon and thought he'd seen everything, received a letter that must have made him question his faith. The King of Spain, defender of the Catholic faith, needed the Holy Father to convince his wife to have sex with him. The Pope's response survives in the Vatican archives. It's a masterpiece of ecclesiastical diplomacy. His Holiness delicately explained that marital relations were not only permitted but required by God. Producing an heir was Maria Josefa's sacred duty. To refuse her husband was to refuse God's will. But even the Pope's letter wasn't enough. Maria Josefa agreed to submit to God's will, but only under certain conditions. She would pray the entire rosary before each encounter. She would keep her eyes closed throughout, and she would think of the Virgin Mary to maintain her spiritual purity. Imagine being Ferdinand. You're the absolute monarch of Spain. You have the power of life and death over millions, and you're lying there while your teenage wife recites Hail Mary, full of grace, while you try to consummate your marriage. It was, by all accounts, the least erotic relationship in royal history. Maria Josefa would lie there like a corpse, lips moving in silent prayer, while Ferdinand attempted to create an heir. The king who collected virgin blood as trophies was reduced to begging for the slightest sign of enthusiasm from his own wife. 10 years they spent in this matrimonial purgatory. 10 years of rosary-accompanied sex. 10 years without producing a single child. When Maria Josefa died in 1829 at age 25, officially of fever, the court breathed a collective sigh of relief. Ferdinand had failed again. 3 wives, 2 dead, 0 legitimate heirs. At 45, diseased from decades of debauchery, Ferdinand had one last chance, and this time he found a queen who was his equal in cunning, if not in perversion. Maria Cristina of Bourbon II, Sicilies, knew exactly what she was getting into. Unlike Ferdinand's previous wives, she came prepared. At 23, she was beautiful, intelligent, and ruthlessly practical. She was also Ferdinand's niece, because apparently incest was the only Bourbon tradition he actually respected. But Maria Cristina had studied her predecessor's failures. She understood that producing an heir wasn't just about politics, it was about solving an engineering problem. The solution came from an unlikely source, the royal physician, Dr. Antonio Hernandez. After examining the king's anatomy and reviewing the medical records of his previous marriages, the good doctor reached a startling conclusion. The problem wasn't just Ferdinand's size, it was the physics of the situation. Think about it like this. If you're trying to plant a seed, but your tool is too large for the garden, you need to modify either the tool or the garden. Since modifying Ferdinand was out of the question, they had to get creative. Dr. Hernandez's solution was elegant in its simplicity. He commissioned the royal craftsman to create a special cushion, una almohadilla, made of the finest silk and stuffed with down feathers. But this wasn't just any cushion. Cut into its centre was a precisely measured hole, exactly 4 centimetres deep. The physics was simple. Ferdinand would insert himself through the hole, which would act as a barrier, preventing him from causing the internal damage that had plagued his previous attempts at procreation. Only the tip, the functionally necessary part, would make contact. Maria Cristina presented this solution to her husband with the diplomatic skills of a seasoned negotiator. She framed it not as an acknowledgement of his deformity, but as a medical necessity for producing healthy heirs. Ferdinand's ego, always his weakness, accepted this narrative. Their first night using the device was reportedly awkward. Ferdinand, used to bragging about his size, now had to accept a limitation. Maria Cristina, ever practical, treated it like any other royal protocol, a necessary procedure for the good of the crown. But it worked. Within 3 months, Maria Cristina was pregnant. The entire court held its breath. Would this pregnancy end like all the others, in blood and death? October 10th, 1830. The cannons of Madrid fired in celebration. Queen Maria Cristina had given birth to a healthy daughter, the future Isabella II. 2 years later, she produced a second daughter, Luisa Fernanda. Ferdinand finally had his heirs. It had only taken 4 wives, 2 deaths, 1 papal intervention, and a specially designed sex cushion. The birth of Isabella created a new problem. Spanish law, the Salic law borrowed from France, forbade female succession. Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, expected to inherit the throne, but Ferdinand, having literally engineered these heirs into existence, wasn't about to let technicality stop him. In a move that would plunge Spain into civil war, Ferdinand issued the pragmatic sanction of 1830, overturning centuries of law to allow his daughter to inherit. When he died in 1833, his sexual dysfunction had one final consequence: the First Carlist War, a bloody conflict that would kill hundreds of thousands, all because a king with a monstrous deformity finally figured out how to use a cushion. But let's return to those trophies Ferdinand mentioned, his collection of blood-stained cloths, because this is where Ferdinand's perversion reaches its darkest depths. After his death in 1833, Maria Cristina ordered a discreet inventory of the king's private chambers. What they found defied belief. Hidden in a cedar chest wrapped in silk were dozens of cloth squares, each carefully labelled with a date and a name. Carmen, Paper's House, March 1821. Isabella, Palace Servant, January 1823. Maria, Widow of Aranjuez, September 1824. The king hadn't been exaggerating. He really had been collecting these grim mementos for nearly 2 decades. Each piece of cloth represented a woman, some willing, some not, who had experienced Ferdinand's particular brand of brutality. But the collection revealed something else, something that palace observers had long suspected. The dates clustered around specific events. After every political setback, after every liberal uprising he crushed, after every execution he ordered, Ferdinand would add multiple trophies to his collection in quick succession. Violence in the throne room led to violence in the bedroom. The man who signed death warrants by day collected virgin blood by night. It was as if crushing political resistance and crushing female innocence were two sides of the same sick coin. One entry stood out to the investigators. Anna, 15 years, daughter of Colonel Bermudez, February 1823. Colonel Bermudez had been one of the liberal officers executed after the failed constitutional revolt. His daughter Anna had come to the palace to beg for her father's life. She left with her father dead and her innocence destroyed, memorialised in Ferdinand's sick collection. This wasn't just a king abusing his power for sexual gratification. This was systematic predation, using sex as another tool of political terror. The liberals Ferdinand couldn't execute. He destroyed through their daughters, their wives, their sisters. The full inventory was never made public. Maria Cristina, showing more wisdom than her late husband ever did, ordered the entire collection burned. But not before several courtiers saw it and recorded what they witnessed. Their accounts match perfectly. Too perfectly to be dismissed as palace gossip. We know Ferdinand kept these trophies. We know he labelled them. We know he added to the collection after moments of political violence. What we don't know is how many women suffered to build this grotesque museum. The cloth that survived suggests dozens. The reality was probably worse. Because here's the thing about predators. They don't advertise their failures. For every blood-stained trophy in that chest, how many women fought him off? How many escaped? How many were silenced before they could tell their stories? We'll never know. Ferdinand took those secrets to his grave, along with the names of victims whose only crime was catching the eye of a king who confused power with permission. When Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833, Spain barely mourned. His own brother immediately declared war. His daughter would face multiple civil wars defending the throne he'd engineered her onto. His widow quickly remarried a common guard, scandalising the nation one final time. But Ferdinand's true legacy wasn't political, it was personal. He had transformed the Spanish monarchy from a sacred institution into a sordid joke. Every king after him would be tainted by association, every royal marriage viewed with suspicion. His daughter Isabella II inherited more than just his throne. She inherited his sexual appetites. Her own scandalous affairs and rumoured nymphomania led to her overthrow in 1868. The Bourbon dynasty that Ferdinand had literally fucked into existence would be fucked out of power by his own bloodline's inherited depravity. Think about that cushion for a moment. A king so deformed that normal human reproduction required engineering intervention. A monarchy so desperate for heirs that it turned the royal bedroom into a medical procedure. That cushion, now lost to history, represents everything wrong with Ferdinand's reign. Power corrupted to the point of physical deformity. Legitimacy so fragile it hung by a thread. Or rather, by a carefully measured hole in a silk pillow. But perhaps the cruelest irony is this. Ferdinand VII is remembered. Not for any great achievements, not for any noble deeds, but for his grotesque anatomy and the suffering it caused. He wanted to be el deseado, the desired one. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without humanity creates monsters. Every historian who studies his reign reaches the same conclusion. As Stanley G. Payne wrote, cowardly, selfish, grasping, suspicious, and vengeful. As Emilio Lapera concluded, the worst of the Habsburg and Bourbon monarchs. As his own contemporary, the Duke of Wellington, observed, the most contemptible of God's creatures. They're all correct, but they're also too kind. Because Ferdinand VII wasn't just a bad king, he was a predator with a crown, a man who turned his physical deformity into a weapon, a ruler who collected human suffering like others collected art. In the end, that's his true legacy, not the throne he passed to his daughter, not the civil wars he sparked, not even the grotesque cushion that finally gave him an heir. His legacy is in the unnamed women in that burned collection. The servants who couldn't refuse, the virgins who became trophies, the wives who died or lived in terror, Ferdinand VII proved that monsters don't need to hide under beds or in dark forests. Sometimes they wear crowns and rule nations. Sometimes they're celebrated as kings. And sometimes, just sometimes, history remembers them for exactly what they were. If you found this story shocking, you need to watch The Medieval Child Bride, 6-year-old forced to marry 29-year-old king. Another tale of royal marriage that will make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval monarchy. The horrors of the bedroom have shaped more history than any battlefield,